Joe Biden's failed economic policies has given us inflation like you can't believe. And the border is in disarray.
It's amazing how few of the people commenting on this have actually bothered to go see what's happening. Well, Congressman Andy Biggs of Arizona actually went to the border.
Biggs, where's Andy? Boy, oh boy, Andy. There's a guy. He's tough.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this edition of What's the Big's Idea, my semi-regular podcast. We try to fill you in what's going on, give you some context about life in Washington, D.C., and the things that affect you and what drive you. Today, I have a tremendous guest with me. I have Darren Beattie with me. He was a speechwriter and policymaker under Donald Trump. Graduate from Duke University with a PhD in political science. He is now the editor at Revolver News. He is the only non-tenured professor who endorsed and correctly predicted Donald Trump's 2016 presidency in the country. And today we've got a couple of topics on the list. And one is big tech overreach, and one is Joe Biden's failed foreign policy. Both things that Darren can really address. But Darren, before we get there, you and I had a conversation that has just blown my mind, and I think about it. I talk to people about it regularly. Some things you and I talked about, I don't know, 3-4 months ago, whatever. And it's about what I'm going to just call context of the American political scene today. Probably been something like it in place for 100 plus years. But will you talk to us and tell us about what you describe as the heuristic through which we can frame American politics?
Indeed, I remember our conversation well, and it's a powerful explanatory tool, and it describes the comparative grifts that really drive the incentives on the Democrat side and on the Republican side. And it can be stated very simply. On the Democrat side, the grift is through the taxpayer. The Democrats win elections and they use taxpayer money to reward their clients, including the sprawling client class that exists within the national bureaucracies themselves, through sort of patronage, make work type jobs and so forth. But the critical observation here is that the Democrats reward their patrons via the power of the purse that ultimately comes from the American taxpayer writ large. Conversely, on the Republican side, the grift exists within a different sphere. The grift is not rewarding their clients with the taxpayer base. The grift comes from the electoral process itself. The process itself is the grift. It comes from not the taxpayers writ large, but from donors, large and small. All the emails people receive saying, donate to us, donate to us. All the consultants that fill up their coffers, fill up their bank accounts, and buy a new mansion on the basis of, in many cases, failed election campaigns. That's where the grift comes from. It comes from the process itself. Now, there are a couple of crucial observations that follow from this. Number one has to do with the incentive structures governing this dynamic. In order for the left or the Democrats, because it's really more about the machinery than the ideology, in order for the Democrats to reward their clients, they actually have to win. Now, to be fair, a lot of that is entrenched because they're already entrenched in the bureaucracies. But in order to get there, they had to win at a certain point in order to have that process unfold. But they have to win the elections in order to get the power of the purse. On the other side, for the Republicans, it's much less important to actually win because, again, the grift largely exists in the process itself. Now, of course, this is a simplification. It's still, better to win. You can reward a little bit more, but I think it does really touch upon a fundamental difference that explains so much of what we see in the Republican sphere and comparatively in the Democrat sphere. And it explains why you can have a bunch of sort of parasitic consultants and so forth, and they don't need to win. The RNC doesn't necessarily need to win. All you need, it's much better to gin up kind of hysteria that translates into milking donors large and small than it is to actually win elections and more broadly win the culture, win in terms of things that are actually meaningful.
So
And
Darren, let me ask just a couple things. Well, they have them in my mind that go with what you're talking about, and then you can keep going on this because I think this is so incredible. I had some thoughts like this, but I could not ever put them as cogently as you have done. So let's just think of a couple things. I think of David Horowitz, who said famously in one of his books, a little tract actually, that everybody thinks love's the biggest motivator, but in politics, the biggest motivator is fear. And what you just said is so salient because you're talking about it is easier for a consultancy class to scare the bejeebies out of people than to actually have to win these elections. And I guess it gets to the point, is that why donors, big donors, I happen to know a guy who's a huge donor, and he doesn't really like me because he thinks I'm too conservative, but he still gives to me a little bit, but he plays with the establishment consultancy class and is given tens, if not $100 million over the years to those people. Why does he keep doing it when his people, his candidates that he's backing, consistently lose?
well, that's a great question. And it gets to the really fascinating issue of donor psychology, which is a somewhat different question, although it's related. It's related but different. And but as long as you asked, I can offer without knowing who this particular person is. I've noticed some general features. First of all, there is a lot of what we might crudely call dumb money on the right and in the GOP. And it goes further than that, though, because it's not simply dumb money. You have to look underneath it. Is it dumb or is it just animated by sort of different expectations and goals than actually winning in the precise sense? I think what motivates a lot of donors is, and people with a lot of money tend to be, somewhat counterintuitively, they tend to be very risk averse. I mean, it makes sense in one way because you have a lot to lose. But it's counterintuitive in the other sense of people tend to think of this concept of FU money. Oh, if only I had money, I would do all of these things that now I'm, holding back on and so forth. I find on the whole, having a lot of money tends to make one risk averse in this sense, in the sense of rocking the boat politically. Now, what motivations these donors have? What value do they give from donating? Sure, it's good to donate to a winning candidate, but I think what a lot of them want, even more than winning, is feeling like they're part of the mix, feeling like they're part of the conversation. If they donate and as a kind of reciprocation for that, they're invited to, some dinner and they get to sit next to some cabinet official, and they get to talk to that person and have a sense that they're on the inside, that they're in the mix, that they matter. That psychological reward is far more important than actually making a meaningful difference in the system, especially when so often, in the few cases where you play for stakes, that fundamentally threatens people's wealth. And you see that probably on the largest scale in this whole kind of Twitter affair with Elon Musk. Now, Elon has not conducted himself perfectly. There are a lot of question marks there and so forth, but it is a rare example of somebody at that level of wealth in some meaningful way challenging the regime in a way that could conceivably threaten his wealth in a profound way and threaten his status as a powerful citizen who's in the mix. I think typically, and especially on the Republican side, what even the big donors want is, and also keep in mind, a lot of these people, maybe they've gotten their wealth, maybe they've inherited their wealth, and maybe they've gotten their wealth from being very talented in a domain of business, but that doesn't leave a lot of time for, and it's seldom correlated with genuine political sophistication. So we're dealing with that as well. So maybe there are some who kind of want to play for keeps, but they wouldn't even necessarily know what that means really. And the people who are the most talented in kind of seducing these donor types are typically going to prevail, and they'll be grifted. So those are a number of factors I've thought of, but I really think, just to put it, I do think it's what so many of a certain type of donor wants, especially in the GOP side, is far more than playing a high stakes game in which they actually stand to lose their wealth and reputation. Is in exchange for their donations, they want to feel like they're in the mix. They want to have that experience where they're sitting next to the cabinet official and they can give their 2 cents and they have their photo and they can, show their friends, hey, look, I had dinner. Look, here's me sitting right next to, Mike Pompeo, or just to take any example. And I think that's largely what governs the incentives and the behavior of your typical big dollar donor
So,
on the GDP side.
so Darren, I just want to see if I'm understanding, because I think you're right, but it isn't a question of them feeling relevant, right? Because if you were feeling relevant, you would have just a genuine get into the weeds type of policy, a love for policy, right? It's more of an affective reward, kind of this emotional, visceral response of I'm part of something. I know I'm generally conservative. I'm generally a Republican, but here it is. I'm going to be part of it. I'm going to be in this crowd of other movers and shakers, who get to sit down with and rub elbows with a Dick Cheney or Mike Pompeo or Mike Pence or whoever.
Right.
So that's just purely an affective reward, as opposed to kind of a policy driving reward. It belies what you call dumb money, or what I would just say is maybe kind of a general outline of what is going on and maybe not understanding it. And I saw a lot of that, by the way, in that speaker fight when big donors called me up and told me we look like a bunch of clowns, and because they had no idea, they could not process what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
and so, I mean, are we talking on the same page?
Yes, absolutely. And again, I think sort of the issue of donor psychology is is a really fascinating one. There are certain subsets of donors who are oriented toward kind of effectiveness in a specific domain, but I think largely speaking, there are a number of problems. One is the sophistication problem, because you think about the ways, it's just a strange thing, and I'm very pro capitalism, but that doesn't mean you can't have certain observations, like the types of things that can put person in the position to be a donor is Okay, maybe they've inherited their wealth, or maybe they've succeeded within a very thin slice, a very thin domain. And it can happen to even people who I think are probably well-meaning and otherwise good. For instance, someone like the Papa John's guy, for instance. Here's somebody who knows everything imaginable about pizza, and became very wealthy on the basis of knowing like exactly what type of tomato sauce to use that would be favorable to profit margins at a certain scale. And all power to him. That's what you would want someone to do. But then when he's thrust into the political world, he gets eaten alive because his narrow sort of business expertise doesn't translate into the kind of, I would even say, kind of the street smarts that you need to play effectively at that high level. And here's someone who may have even wanted to play for keeps in some fashion. So there are two layers of it. Most of them don't want to play for keeps because, again, the reputational damage and the risks are too much, and most of them are risk averse. But even for the handful that want to play the keeps, very few are in a position to be sophisticated enough to know what that means. And you can look on the other side. You have, again, it's not like the other side is super sophisticated, but the paradigmatic example would be someone like George Soros. And again, when you look at how he made his money, he didn't make his money through pizza, through knowing what the right tomato sauce was. He made his money in a domain that was already interconnected into the kind of the power games as such, and therefore his money and connections translated much more easily and naturally into leveraging it for political power than it would for someone like the Papa John's guy, for instance. And also, Soros was willing and capable of playing for keeps. So again, you don't see too many of the counterparts there on the right. And I think it also bears pointing out, to get back to our earlier observation about sort of the right's grift being the process itself, is that given that the left, generally speaking, I'm just using left and right as available terms. I know that they're simplifications, but generally speaking, given that the left enjoys cultural and political and institutional predominance, basically every meaningful institution in the country is left wing in a certain critical sense. You could say that a lot of this is a function of the fact that the right is simply not set up for meaningful victories. It's set up as a kind of fake oppositional force or a pressure valve. And because the right and its infrastructure, including the media, by the way, of which I'm strangely a part. I can't believe I'm a media guy, but I am now a journalist. And even the right-wing media is so disconnected from the power structure that its function is basically to serve up hysteria in various ways that people like to consume because it's cathartic, but it's not connected to meaningful results. And you could see that even a little bit, all of the powerful, the most powerful forces in conservative media pretty much, were opposed to Ronna McDaniel, right? And that made no difference even on the Republican side. And so I think the detachment of the right-wing media from power, even in the GOP world, sort of recapitulates the detachment of power between the GOP and and power at a national scale. And I think when you're fundamentally detached from reality and you can't achieve meaningful results on sort of high stakes things, that results in a number of perverse incentives. And because it forces you to engage in kind of maybe more fantasy, more hysteria, or more grifting, because those are the only options when you're not sufficiently plugged into real power to kind of enthusiastically take on the responsibilities that are attendant to that. And so it's not really, I'm not blaming the media. I'm the part of it. I suffer from this too. And it's nothing, that the media itself has done wrong. It's just, this is the framework in which it exists. And this is the framework within which the GOP exists, which is one in which it's not set up to succeed in a meaningful way. And because it has that sort of junior partner kind of feature stamped onto it, I think that really contributes to, it feeds into this dynamic where the grift is the process, because they're not in a position to command authority over the broader tax base in the way that the Democrats are.
So, Darren, I've got two questions. We've got about 5 minutes left. The first one is, you haven't really mentioned ideology in the advancement of the grift and its role in the grift. And so I want to get to that. And then the second thing you touched on just a second ago, you said that effectively that the Republicans aren't set up to win. What would you say we need to do to get set up to win, besides just changing the grift away from the process itself?
I mean, it's a tough question. And, I hesitate to speak like this. I can speak like this with you because a lot of people can misconstrue it as a kind of demoralizing thing. But for me, I think it's actually, what's demoralizing is to labor under delusions. I think what's very invigorating is the more that we're connected to reality, and the more we're capable of sort of soberly assessing the situation we're in. That's a real path to a long-term victory. But the basic infrastructure isn't quite there, and what we could do to begin to achieve it, I mean, that's a very tough thing. That's, small steps in my own domain, as at revolver.news. Of course, we try to be entertaining. We try to, give people things we want, but we also try to cover important things thematically. And I think one theme running through our coverage is updating people on the right to the new reality that the national security state is actively hostile toward them, which is now something that is almost as kind of commonplace and uncontroversial as to seem, kind of a trivial thing to say, but it wasn't even the case, 5 or 6 years ago. This is something that required a kind of education, and education in a specific way, because of how I think the political psychology of the right is constructed. And so within the media domain, I think that was a service. Now, do we have, the power and the leverage to fundamentally reform the national security state? No, but this was an important step that was rooted in reality that I think enhanced people's understanding, which is a precondition to getting there. And, similarly in Congress, I think kind of having a thorough account of what's been going on in the big tech world, what they've been doing, their, relationships with, government actors, how the problem is not really one of the private sector or the public sector. It's this revolving door between the government and tech. That's useful to understand. It's useful even to have people like Elon, who are, kind of major players, notwithstanding all of the legitimate criticisms toward him, to have a step where he's sort of doing a hostile takeover of one of the major tech firms, and perhaps changing it for the better, or at least symbolically offering a proof of concept as this is another way we can do it, and arguably is more effective than anything in government. That's also a positive thing. And so those are all domains where I would say these are kind of meaningful results, and we need to kind of continue in that direction. And mostly on the underlying sense is we need to collect and appeal to just smart and talented people with who are anchored in reality. And that's a hard thing because, on the one hand, we know that the regime is deeply corrupt, it's deeply illegitimate. We can't trust anything the regime media says. And so, how, without any anchor in a sort of authoritative regime voice, how do you swim in the open ocean like that without getting hysterical and distracted by every kind of shiny object, or in this case, every balloon we see, something like that? It's like, how, and it's a really hard thing to do. And I don't mean it in a critical way. It's like, it's a problem that people on the left, who tend to be just extremely dogmatic and unreflective, they simply can take their talking points from the regime institutions. But how do we sort of, we need some kind of anchor points, and we don't have them from the regime media. But I see a problem. What's happening on the right is sort of, people are demoralized because deep down they know that there's no connection to power in the way that I was describing, and they're paranoid and suspicious for good reason, because they know that the government and the media and other powerful institutions have been lying to them and have nothing but hostile intentions to them. And so, how do you remain anchored? What kind of principles of judgment do you use to decide, okay, what's real, what's not, what's the real conspiracy, and what's just something ridiculous? It's very hard, because I don't think people in the aggregate are really constructed to have to make those determinations on a daily basis. But there's no kind of authority that people can trust. And I think that's sort of I hate to use the graduate school term, but it's sort of like almost an epistemological problem. It's a problem with the nature of, it's a problem with the nature of knowing. How do we
Yeah.
how do we know, and then what's important to know as well. And it's a real challenge, but sort of that's another place that I would look toward in terms of building up the kind of a real meaningful infrastructure that we need. But I think most people at this point understand that the bread and circuses of day-to-day politics, while fun, while cathartic, and believe me, Revolver.news covers our fair share of it, because it's entertaining, it's part of the news cycle. But I think it's important to at least maintain the distinction between what's the bread and circuses, and what are the real things to focus on that pertain to building that infrastructure, so that we can begin to play for real stakes and for meaningful results.
That's awesome. And I would just tell you, ladies and gentlemen who are watching, if you want to get some authoritative sources, by the way, Darren, I get this all the time. Where do you go for news? Where do you, and I said, there's plenty of places I trust. And even in that cache of information, I am skeptical of certain things that I've seen. You have to be, and that's part of our problem. I think the right seems to be much more introspective, self-questioning. The left, they just seem to, they're defined by what they believe and want their outcome to be. So you can always find Darren at revolver.news, I believe is the actual I just have to get it, just start with the R, and I'm into your news site, Darren. But and you can follow him at Darren Beattie, at
Darren J. Beattie.
Darren J. Beattie.
Darren J. Beattie on Twitter for other insights. But yeah, I mean, I'm very, very pleased with the conversation. We could have gone in any direction. We could have talked about some of the other things that are important and part of the news cycle. But I think this is the kind of conversation that provides depth and insight that it really kind of work towards some of the solutions that we're describing. We need to start to think in these terms and be critical to the point of of almost kind of a painful experience, painfully self-critical and self-reflective, in the sense of why are we where we are? What are the incentive structures governing the present circumstances, and how do we move toward a more kind of favorable dynamic and favorable outcome? And I think it was a great conversation. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Darren. Appreciate it. And please follow Darren. You'll find he's a wealth of information, and we need that in this time. You can follow me at Rep Andy Biggs AZ, biggs.house.gov. You can go find me. This podcast is on Spotify, on Apple Podcast. You can also when you go to biggs.house.gov, you can see my documentary film on the border. But we encourage you to get as much information as you can. Speaking of heuristics, I mean, that's one way to heuristically resolve issues, is to get as much information as you possibly can, create something contextually. So a great conversation. I wish we had more time. Thanks for joining me today, Darren. Really appreciate it. We'll have to do it again. And I'll see you somewhere at some event in the future, I know, and we can talk some more. But thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today. With that, God bless you, and we'll talk again soon.